I put on the shortest, reddest, most indecent dress I owned to get myself out of marrying a woman I had never met. Roswin Ashgrave looked at the hem, then at my face, and told an entire hall of merchants that she liked my sense of humor. To understand how I got there, I have to go back 3 weeks to the night my Uncle Desmond stood at the head of our dinner table and told me, between the soup and the bread, that I had been sold. He didn't use that word. He never did. He called it a debt bond, called it an honor, called it the only thing standing between Calloway House and the auction of every loom, every bolt of silk, every roof over every seamstress who had worked for my family since before I was born. 812,000 marks. That was the number he said out loud, once, like it explained everything, and then he never said it again for the rest of dinner. The Ashgrave Compact has agreed to accept the debt bond in place of seizure, he said, cutting his bread into perfect, bloodless squares. You'll be presented at the merchant court on the 20th. Formal dress. Modest cut. They've sent measurements. I was 26 years old. I had been keeping this family's real books in a locked drawer under my bed for 6 years, catching the errors my uncle made when he thought no one was looking, and in that moment I understood that none of it had ever counted for anything, because the only ledger that mattered to him was the one where I was an asset instead of a person. My mother didn't look up from her plate. My cousins didn't look up either, except to smirk at each other, the particular smirk reserved for the family's unclaimed, unbonded, useless Omega daughter finally being made useful. I had heard that smirk in 100 rooms. I had never once liked it. And if I refuse, I said. You won't, Desmond said, and buttered his bread. And that was the whole conversation. I went to Goldie Finch's shop that night with my measurements folded in my pocket like a summons, and I told her what they wanted me to wear and what I intended to wear instead. You want me to help you get rejected by the Widow Queen of Ashgrave, Goldie said, around a mouthful of pins. I want to pick the price tag, I said. If I'm going to be sold, I'll at least choose what it says on the label. Goldie had heard me complain for 6 years about being invisible, about being the daughter nobody wanted to look at twice, and she had a seamstress's respect for irony. She pulled a bolt of red silk off a shelf that had been earmarked for curtains nobody would ever buy, and by midnight we had a dress with a neckline that would scandalize a funeral and a slit that went most of the way to a decision I hadn't fully made yet. Everyone in Thornmere knew who the Widow Queen was. You didn't have to have met her. Her name arrived in a room before she did, the way weather does. Roswin Ashgrave ran the largest trade compact on 3 coasts, had inherited it at 22 when her mother died mid-negotiation, and had buried a bonded wife at 31 in a warehouse fire that made the front page for a week and then, by unspoken agreement, was never mentioned again. She was said to be cold in the specific, controlled way of someone who had once not been cold at all and had decided never to make that mistake twice. She was said to have refused every marriage offer that came with a face attached, and finally accepted one that came with a debt attached instead, because at least a debt didn't pretend to want her. I did not want to marry a stranger to save a family that had never once asked me what I wanted. I wanted, for one afternoon of my life, to be the one making the choice, even if the choice was to be refused. The morning of the 20th, I stood in my room with the sanctioned gown, gray, high-collared, the fabric of a woman apologizing for existing, laid out on the bed next to the red dress hidden under a false bottom in my wardrobe since midnight. My mother knocked. I told her I needed a minute. I put on the red one. I remember the numbers of that morning with the strange, useless precision that fear gives you. 14 buttons on the back that Goldie had to fasten from memory because my hands wouldn't hold still. 6 minutes in the car to the merchant court. 41 steps up the front stairs because I counted them instead of thinking about what waited at the top. At the top, Desmond saw the dress and went the color of old paper. "Change," he said, low, furious, a hand already reaching for my elbow. "There's no time," I said, and smiled at him with all the teeth I owned, and walked into the hall myself, alone, 40 seconds before the doors were meant to open for me properly, on my own 2 feet, in a dress no one had approved, toward a woman I had never seen and fully intended never to see again after that day. The doors were already open. She was already looking at me, and the whole plan I had built out of red silk and spite came apart in her hands before I ever got close enough to speak. The merchant court hall held 200 people, and every one of them turned to look at me at once, which is a specific kind of violence I had not adequately prepared for. Somewhere behind me, I heard my aunt make a sound like a kettle starting to boil. Somewhere to my left, a Calloway cousin actually said the word scandal out loud, delighted, already composing the story she'd tell at the next dinner. I did not look at any of them. I looked at the dais, because that was where the woman who owned my family's debt was sitting, and I had come to be refused by her specifically, not by a room full of people who had never once defended me when it mattered. The widow queen of Ashgrave was younger than the stories made her sound and stiller than any person I had ever watched. She sat the way some people stand, like the ground had been consulted first. Black coat, no ornament, a signet ring the only thing on her that looked expensive on purpose. When I came close enough, the room's chatter dropped low enough that I heard. Underneath it, the note that had been under my whole plan the entire time and that I hadn't let myself listen to until now. Black pepper and cold brass, sharp and clean. The smell of a person who had decided a long time ago that warmth was a liability. She did not stand. She did not gasp. She looked at the hem of my dress, unhurried, the way you'd read a line of a contract you found interesting, and then she looked at my face, and something in her expression moved that had clearly not been asked to move in a long time. "Approach," she said. Not loud. The whole room heard it anyway. I walked the last 20 feet like it was 100. Up close her eyes were a pale, storm water gray, and there was a stillness to her mouth that I would later learn was not coldness at all, just a very old habit of not giving anything away for free. "Roswyn Ashgrave," Desmond said behind me, scrambling to recover the room. "My niece has clearly, there's been some confusion regarding the dress code. She will change immediately. I assure you the Calloway house did not intend any. Was this your idea?" Roswyn said. To me, not to him. The room held its breath in a way I could physically feel against my skin. "Yes," I said. "All of it?" The dress. The timing. Walking in before the doors opened for me properly, I lifted my chin because if I was going to be refused, I intended to be refused for the truth. I was told to be presented modestly for your approval, like livestock at auction. I decided if I was going to be inspected, I'd at least choose what you were inspecting. Somewhere behind me, my uncle made a small, strangled noise. I ignored it. Roswyn Ashgrave looked at me for 3 full seconds. I counted them, because counting was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. And then the corner of her mouth did something I was not prepared for at all. It went up. "Do you know," she said, "how many people have stood in front of me in the last 9 years wearing exactly what they were told to wear? Saying exactly what they were told to say, hoping I wouldn't notice they were terrified. You are the first person who has ever walked in here looking like they were about to declare war on me instead." "I was hoping you'd refuse me," I said, because apparently today was a day for saying things out loud that were supposed to stay in my head. That was the entire plan. "I know," Roswyn said. "I could see the plan from the door. It's a good dress. Whoever made it should be paid properly and not in curtain remnants. Somewhere in the crowd, Goldie made a small triumphant sound she immediately smothered. But I don't accept debt bonds because I'm interested in modest women in gray, Miss Calloway. I accept them because they're the only honest transaction left in this city. Everyone else who's ever stood there pretended they wanted to be there. You are the first one who told me the truth before I even asked for it. That doesn't sound like acceptance, I said. That sounds like you're about to reject me for a much better reason than my uncle expects. It's not a rejection, she said, and stood, finally, unfolding to a height that made the whole dais feel smaller. The contract stands. I'm not interested in the version of you that would have worn the gray dress. I'll take the one standing in front of me. Rebellion included. She looked past me, toward Desmond, whose face had gone the color of the wallpaper. The debt is discharged as of this hour. The bond is accepted as presented. A beat, dry as flint. Exactly as presented. The hall exploded into a noise that wasn't quite scandal and wasn't quite applause. My uncle looked like a man who had won a war and lost the treaty, and Roswin Ashgrave held out one hand to me, unhurried, entirely certain, in front of 200 witnesses who would talk about this for a year. Come home, she said. You've clearly had a very long morning. I put my hand in hers because I did not, in that moment, have a single working alternative, and the last thing I heard as we walked out through a side door together was my aunt whispering, too loud, that she had never in her life seen anything so improper. Roswin didn't look back at the sound. I did, once, and found Desmond staring after us with an expression I couldn't yet name and would come to understand, much later, as fear. The Ashgrave residence occupied the top 4 floors of a building that had its own name, which felt to me like the final, absurd punctuation on a morning that had already broken every rule I understood about how my life was supposed to go. The elevator alone took longer than the drive from my house to the merchant court, and I spent the whole climb very aware of the 11 inches of red silk between my knees and public decency, and even more aware of the woman standing beside me who had not, even once, looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. You don't have staff meet us at the door, I said, mostly to fill the silence, because silence around her had a texture I wasn't used to yet. Dense, unbothered, nothing like the brittle quiet of my own house. I have staff. I told them to stay downstairs today. The elevator opened onto a hallway with floors the color of wet slate and not one single portrait, which struck me as strange in a house this old and this proud. You had a morning. You don't need an audience for the rest of it. I did not know what to do with a woman who fed my dignity instead of eating it, so I changed the subject, badly. This is not the reaction I planned for. I gathered. She led me down the hall, unhurried, hands in her coat pockets. What was the plan, exactly, once I refused you? Had you thought that far? No, I admitted. I think I assumed the world would simply reorganize itself around my dignity once you sent me home in disgrace. A common miscalculation, Roswin said. The world rarely reorganizes itself around anyone's dignity. It reorganizes itself around debt, mostly, sometimes around spite, rarely around anything nicer than that. She stopped at a set of double doors and opened them onto a room 3 times the size of my bedroom at home, all pale wood and gray linen, and one enormous window facing east. This is yours. I'll have someone bring your things from the Calloway house by evening. I stood in the doorway of a room bigger than my family's parlor and felt, for the first time since the dinner 3 weeks ago, something other than fury. It felt uncomfortably close to being seen, and I did not trust it yet. You could have refused me, I said. You still could. I'll wear the dress every day if I have to. I don't doubt it. Something almost like amusement moved behind her eyes. I've never once cared what people wear to war, Miss Calloway. I've only ever cared whether they show up. You showed up in the one thing that told me the truth. I'd be a fool to send that back. She left me there with that sentence sitting in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, and it was hours before the ripples stopped moving. By the end of the first week, I had learned 3 things about the Ashgrave house that no one had bothered to tell me at the merchant court. The first was that the staff, after the initial shock, treated me with a wary, assessing courtesy that made it clear my presence was a novelty they hadn't decided how to file yet. The second was that the kitchen, run by a broad-shouldered beta named Priya, who had been with the house 11 years, kept a pot of something warm on the stove at all hours, a habit I later learned had started the year Rosewen's first wife died, and no one had had the heart to stop it. The third was that Rosewen Ashgrave, feared across 3 coasts, apparently could not operate a coffee machine to save her life, and stood in front of it most mornings with the flat, betrayed expression of a woman losing a negotiation to an appliance. You could just ask someone, I told her, the 4th morning, watching her glare at a machine that was, admittedly, unnecessarily complicated. I run a compact worth 400 million marks, she said, without turning around. I am not going to be defeated by a machine that makes coffee. You already have been. Twice this week. She turned then, and there was something almost sheepish in it, an expression I suspected very few people in this city had ever been permitted to see. I crossed the kitchen, nudged her aside with my shoulder, an act of casual physical contact that made her go very still, in a way I noted and filed away without yet knowing what to do with it, and made 2 cups properly, the way Goldie had taught me years ago in the back of her shop, waiting for deliveries that never came on time. There, I said, handing her the cup. You survived to fight the machine another day. You didn't have to do that. No, I agreed. But I wanted to see the look on your face when the empire builder got beaten by a French press. Something in her chest moved, a sound too short to be a laugh, gone before I could be sure of it. You're not what the file said you'd be. There's a file? There's always a file. She drank her coffee, watching me over the rim in a way that made my pulse do something complicated. It described you as quiet, compliant, useful for the books, apparently, though your uncle never once mentioned that in the negotiations. I wonder why he'd leave that out. I filed that thought away too, next to the stillness in her shoulders, because something in the careless way she'd said it, useful for the books, had snagged on a thread of my own suspicion that I hadn't yet had the courage to pull. That afternoon, my uncle came to visit under the guise of concern for my adjustment, and stayed exactly long enough to ask, twice, whether the debt discharge paperwork had been formally filed with the compact's registrar yet, and to look profoundly relieved when I told him I didn't know. He left without asking me a single question about how I was actually doing, and Rosewen watched him go from the top of the stairs with an expression I couldn't read at all, cold and careful, and entirely unlike the one she'd worn over the coffee machine that morning. Your uncle is very concerned about paperwork, she said, once his car had pulled away. He's always been concerned about paperwork, I said. It's the only thing he's ever been consistent about. Rosewen didn't answer that, but she watched the empty driveway a long moment before she came back inside, and something about the careful blankness of her face told me she had noticed exactly the same thread I had, and was choosing, for now, not to pull it either. I found the room on the 9th night, looking for a book Priya had mentioned, and instead found a door that opened onto something I understood immediately I was not supposed to see. It was small, tucked at the end of a hallway I hadn't been shown, and it held a single armchair, a stack of unread paperbacks with cracked spines, and a woman's coat still hanging on a hook by the window. The wool gone soft with age and dust. On the side table sat a photograph of Roswen, younger, unguarded, laughing at something outside the frame, with her arm around another woman, whose face I didn't recognize, but whose smile made something in my chest ache on principle alone. I didn't touch anything. I was still standing in the doorway when Roswen's voice came from behind me. Quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her yet. Her name was Aniki. I turned. She wasn't angry. She looked, instead, like someone standing at the edge of very cold water, deciding whether to go in. "I'm sorry," I said. "I wasn't trying to, I know." She came and stood beside me in the doorway, not entering. The way you don't enter a church you no longer believe will answer you. She died 3 years ago, a fire, at one of the warehouses. I was 40 minutes away in a meeting about tariff percentages that I could not, to this day, tell you the outcome of. Her jaw worked once. I built every rule I have after that, every schedule. Every locked door in this house that isn't locked against thieves, it's locked against ever again being 40 minutes away from something I could have stopped. "That's not a rule," I said, before I could stop myself. "That's a wound wearing a rule's clothes." She looked at me like I'd said something in a language she hadn't heard spoken correctly in years. "Maybe," she said, finally. It kept me upright. Whatever it was. Being upright and being alive aren't always the same thing. I don't know where the courage came from to say it. Perhaps the same place the red dress had come from, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. "You've been very kind to me this week, kinder than anyone in my own family managed in 6 years. But I notice you've been kind at a very careful distance, like you're worried about what happens if you're not." Roswen didn't answer that directly. She closed the door to the small room, gently, the way you'd close a door on someone sleeping, and for a moment I thought I'd overstepped in a way that couldn't be walked back. "Ask me something else tomorrow," she said instead. "Something that isn't about her." I find I want to answer your questions, which is new, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with new. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was the shape warmth leaves behind before it arrives, and I went to bed that night thinking about it far longer than I meant to. It was the ledgers that undid the careful piece of that week, in the end, and it was my own fault, because I couldn't stop myself from checking. I had been the one keeping Calloway House's real books since I was 20, a fact my uncle had never once acknowledged in front of anyone and had used freely in private whenever a number needed explaining that he didn't want to explain himself. Habit, more than suspicion, made me ask Roswen's registrar for a copy of the discharge debt bond paperwork. I told myself I only wanted to see my own name typed into a document that had rearranged my life, which was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth arrived at 11 at night in Roswen's study, where I sat with the paperwork and a lamp and a very bad feeling that would not leave me alone. The debt the compact had forgiven wasn't 812,000 marks. It was 406. Half, my uncle had told our family, our staff, the entire merchant court, a number twice the size of the actual debt, and I understood, sitting there with the real figure staring back at me in the compact's clean typeface, exactly where the other 406,000 marks had gone, because I had seen smaller versions of that same gap in the Calloway books for 6 years, and had always been too frightened, or too dutiful, or too tired to say the word out loud. Embezzlement. My uncle had inflated the debt to the court, pocketed the difference over years of doctored invoices, and used my marriage, my body, signed over like a settlement, to make the discrepancy disappear cleanly before anyone thought to look. If the debt bond had gone through quietly, no one would ever have compared the numbers. He needed this marriage to succeed exactly as much as I had needed it to fail, and for entirely uglier reasons. I sat with that fact until the lamp burned low and understood with a cold, sinking clarity that my rebellious dress hadn't threatened his plan at all. It had, by accident, been the safest possible outcome for him, a scandal loud enough to distract from a number no one would think to check twice. Roswen found me there near midnight, the papers spread across her desk like evidence at a trial I hadn't yet decided how to bring. "You look like you found something you wish you hadn't," she said. "I think my uncle stole 400,000 marks from your compact," I said, and used me to bury it. The room went very still. Somewhere outside a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling and gone. "Say that again," Roswen said. "Not sharp. Careful," the voice of someone deciding how much weight a sentence could bear before she picked it up. "The discharge paperwork says 406,000. He told the court 812. I've kept our books for 6 years. I know what a gap like that looks like when someone's been feeding it invoices that don't exist." My hands were shaking again the way they had the morning of the presentation, except this time there was no dress to hide behind. "If you cancel the marriage now, over this, no one questions the paperwork. It just looks like the debt bond fell through. He gets away with it clean." "I'm not going to cancel the marriage," Roswen said, and something in the flatness of it steadied me more than any comfort could have. "I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes, and then I'm going to make him wish he'd simply let the compact seize the looms." It should have frightened me, the cold certainty in her voice. Instead, it felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like standing next to someone who was finally, entirely on my side. We did not move quickly in the days after that because Roswen was the kind of alpha who preferred proof to fury, and fury, unspent, has a way of becoming its own kind of heat. It found us both on the 9th night of the audit, in the study past 2 in the morning, with 3 years of compact invoices spread across the desk between us and my eyes burning from reading numbers until they stopped meaning anything. I hadn't slept properly in days, neither had she. The air in the room had thickened without either of us noticing, the particular charged stillness that comes before a storm breaks. And it took me embarrassingly long to understand that the storm in question was standing 4 feet away from me, smelling like black pepper and cold brass gone sharp at the edges, and that the reason my own skin felt too warm for the room had very little to do with the invoices. "You should sleep," Roswen said, not moving from where she stood. "So should you. I don't, much, not since she didn't finish it. She didn't need to." I closed the ledger in front of me because my hands had started doing the thing they did when my body decided something before my mind caught up, a warmth low in my stomach that I recognized with a lurch of alarm as the early edge of a heat I hadn't expected for another 2 weeks, brought on early, the doctors always said, by stress, by proximity, by exactly this kind of night. "Roswen," my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "I think I need you to leave the room. Now, before I don't want you to." She went still in the doorway, every line of her suddenly, visibly, an alpha holding a leash on her own instincts with both hands. "Tell me what you need," she said. Not a demand, a genuine question, the kind that costs something to ask honestly. "I need you to not come any closer unless I ask you to." My whole body was arguing with the sentence even as I said it. "And I need you to know that if I do ask, it's not because of the fever. It's because I've wanted to since the coffee machine, and I was too proud to say so before now." Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, just enough. "Tell me to stop and I will. At any point. I need you to hear that before anything else happens in this room." "I hear you," I said. "Ask me with your words too. I want to hear you say what you want, not just what you'll allow." "I want," Roswen said, and stopped. like the sentence cost her more than any negotiation she'd ever closed, to cross this room and put my hands on your face and not let go for a while. That's all. Tonight, I'm not going to take anything from you that you haven't handed me first. Then cross the room, I said. She did, slowly, giving me every second I might have needed to say otherwise, and when her hands finally found my face, they were careful in a way that undid something in my chest far more thoroughly than urgency would have. The kiss that followed was slow enough to feel like a question answered, rather than a door kicked open, and when she pulled back to check my face again, checking, always checking, the way someone checks a door they've locked 3 times already, I laughed, unsteady, and told her she could stop asking permission for at least the next 5 minutes. I intend to ask permission for considerably longer than 5 minutes, she said against my temple, and I felt the words more than heard them. I've spent 3 years being careful with everything I touch. I'm not going to stop now, least of all with you. We didn't go further than that. That night, the invoices were still on the desk, my heat was still 2 weeks premature, and neither of us trusted a decision made at its edge. But I fell asleep on her shoulder in the study chair sometime after 3, and woke at dawn to find she hadn't moved, hadn't slept, had simply sat there the whole night keeping watch over both the ledgers and me, like we were both things worth guarding. It was in the gray hour after that dawn that she told me about Anarchy properly, not the guarded fragment from the doorway of the small room, but the whole shape of it, how they'd met at a shipping conference neither wanted to attend, how Anarchy had laughed at her first attempt at flirting so hard she'd had to leave the room, how the fire had started in a warehouse 3 blocks from a meeting Roswen still, 3 years later, could not remember the outcome of. I told myself afterward that control was the only thing standing between me and losing someone else that way, she said, watching the window go from gray to gold. I built a whole life out of never again being surprised by anything. And then you walked into the merchant court in a dress no one approved, and I understood, standing there, that I'd built myself a very expensive cage and called it strength. It wasn't weakness, I said. Grief rarely is. No, she agreed. But mistaking control for strength was. I'm working on telling the difference. Her fingers found mine on the desk between us, not gripping, just resting there, present. You make that easier than it should be. I told her, in turn, about my father, dead 9 years, and the 6 years since spent as the only person in Calloway House who could read a balance sheet without lying to herself about what it said, invisible labor no one thanked me for, and everyone relied on. I told her about the debt bond dinner, the soup, the bread cut into perfect squares, my cousin's smirks. I told her I had spent so long being useful and unseen that I had forgotten there was a difference between the two, until a woman in a black coat looked at a scandalous dress and saw the fight underneath it instead of the fabric. I see you, Roswen said, simply, like it was the easiest true thing she'd said all week. I saw you the moment you walked in. The dress was never the interesting part. We had perhaps 4 days of that, warmth, quiet mornings, her hand finding mine across a desk covered in evidence, before the outside world remembered we existed and came looking for blood. The story broke on a Tuesday, timed, I would learn later, to land exactly 2 days before the compact's quarterly filing, when the papers would carry the most weight and do the most damage. A photograph of me in the red dress, grainy and cropped to make the neckline look worse than it was, ran beside a headline that called me a fortune hunter who had staged a public scandal to trap the widow queen into a marriage neither the family nor the court had properly vetted. An anonymous source, I did not need to guess whose voice that anonymity belonged to, was quoted saying the Calloway family had grave concerns about my judgment, my motives, and my fitness to be trusted with a compact of that size. My uncle had gotten ahead of the audit by burning me first. Roswyn's face, when she read it standing in the kitchen with her coffee going cold in her hand, did something I had not seen it do before. A shutting, swift and total. Like a door slamming somewhere behind her eyes. "I'll handle it," she said. "Handle it how?" "Quietly, I'll issue a statement through the Compact's counsel and keep you out of the press entirely until the audit is finished properly." She was already moving toward her study, already retreating into the version of herself that solved problems by controlling every variable in the room, and I understood. Watching her go, that she had done this before, closed a door on someone she loved to protect them from a fire she couldn't stop fast enough. "Roswyn, I need to make calls," she said, not looking back. "You're doing the thing," I said. "The cage thing. You're deciding this for both of us instead of with me." She stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around. "I'm trying to keep you safe. You're trying to control the outcome so you're never 40 minutes away again," I said, and the words landed harder than I meant them to, because they were true, and because I was frightened too, and fear makes accurate aim easier sometimes than kindness does. I understand why. I don't think it's the same thing as keeping me. She didn't answer. The study door closed, gently, deliberately, and the click of the lock was the loudest sound I had heard in that house since I'd arrived in it. I went back to my room that night and did the only thing I had ever known how to do when the world decided without me. I took the red dress out from where it had been hanging, pristine in the closet since the day of the presentation, and I folded it carefully into a box, the way you put away something you've decided is finished being useful. I did not cry. I had done enough of that at 20, learning to read ledgers no one thanked me for. I sat on the edge of the bed with the box in my lap and understood, with the particular clarity of a night that has already gone as badly as it can, that being seen and being protected were not, apparently, the same gift, and that I had let myself believe, for 11 days, that I had finally found both. I did not sleep. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I stopped waiting to be rescued from the feeling, and did instead the only thing that had ever actually worked for me, in 6 years of being underestimated in every room I walked into. I got up, turned on every light in the study she'd locked herself away from me in, and asked Priya, gently, to let me back into the room, because I had a ledger to finish, and I was done waiting for someone else to hand me the ending. I worked through what remained of the night the way I had taught myself to work through every crisis Calloway House had ever handed me, with numbers, because numbers didn't lie even when people did. Roswyn's registrar had given me partial access to the Compact's invoice history during the audit. What I needed now was the rest of it, and I needed it before the quarterly filing made the story impossible to fix quietly. By 5 a.m, I had it. 3 years of shipping manifests, cross-referenced against Calloway House's own doctored copies, showed a pattern so clean it was almost elegant. My uncle had been inflating debt figures on paper while diverting real invoices through a Shell Logistics account registered, absurdly, in the name of a cousin who did not know the account existed. 406,000 marks, exactly the gap between what he'd told the court and what he actually owed. Sitting in an account he'd been quietly draining for 11 months while I sat in my childhood bedroom, keeping the family's real books like a good invisible daughter. I printed it all, 41 pages, the same number as the stairs I'd climbed on the morning of the presentation. And I noticed the coincidence and let myself find it funny, because if I didn't laugh at something that morning, I was going to do something else instead. Roswyn was in the study when I brought it to her, unshaven, unslept. A woman who had spent the night failing to solve a problem alone that had never been hers to solve alone in the first place. "I found the account," I said, and set the pages on the desk between us, the way I had learned, over 6 years, to set truth in front of people who preferred not to look at it. It's not a suspicion anymore. It's a paper trail. Your registrar can verify every page by 9 this morning if you want it verified before you use it. She looked at the pages, then at me, and something in her face broke open in a way I hadn't seen from her yet. Not the shutting down I'd watched the night before, but its opposite, a door swinging wide. "You did this alone," she said. "All night. While I was in here doing the exact thing you told me not to do. I did this because I've spent 6 years being the only competent person in a house that never once said thank you for it," I said. "I wasn't going to let one bad night make me forget how to do the one thing I've always been good at." "I shouldn't have locked that door," Roswin said. "Not against you. I built every rule I have out of not wanting to lose someone again. And last night I proved I still don't know the difference between protecting a person and shutting them out of their own rescue." "No," I agreed. "You didn't. But you're here now, and so am I, and there are 41 pages on this desk that are going to end my uncle's career by lunchtime, if we use them right." Something that was almost a laugh moved through her, rough with exhaustion and relief both. "Then, let's use them right." She called an emergency session of the merchant court for that afternoon. I did not go home to change into anything modest. I wore the same dress I'd slept in 12 minutes of that night, because I understood, by then, that the version of me worth presenting to that room had never been about the clothes at all. The merchant court hall was fuller for the emergency session than it had been for my presentation, which told me everything I needed to know about how quickly this city loved a scandal and how much faster it loved a second one layered on top of the first. My uncle stood near the front in the good suit he wore to negotiations, wearing an expression of wounded dignity he had clearly rehearsed on the drive over. Roswen did not waste time on ceremony. She had the registrar project the manifests onto the screen behind the DIs, 3 years of them, the doctored Callaway copies beside the real compact originals. The gap between them lit up in red the color of the dress that had started all of this. 406,000 marks, she said to the room. In the flat, absolute voice I now understood was hers under pressure, the one that had accepted a debt bond, because it was the only honest transaction left in her life. Diverted over 11 months through an account registered to a relative who has never once accessed it. I would ask Desmond Callaway to explain the discrepancy to this court, since he was so eager to explain his niece's wardrobe to the press 3 days ago. The room's attention swung to my uncle like a compass finding north. He opened his mouth, and for one long moment I watched him try to find the version of himself that had always talked his way out of every room he'd ever cornered himself in. "This is a fabrication," he said, "designed by a woman desperate to distract from her own. The account has your signature on the opening documents," I said. And the room turned to me instead, and for the first time in my life, I did not flinch under 200 pairs of eyes. "I've kept this family's real books since I was 20, Uncle. I know your handwriting better than you do. You didn't think anyone in that house was paying close enough attention to notice. You were wrong. I was the only one who ever was." The silence that followed had a different texture than the one that had greeted my dress 3 weeks earlier. This one had teeth in it, and they weren't pointed at me. Desmond's composure went in stages, like a building coming down floor by floor. First, the color left his face. Then, the practiced dignity. By the time 2 court officials moved to escort him from the hall for formal questioning, he was shouting something about family loyalty that no one in that room, including his own wife, moved to defend. Roswen let him get almost to the doors before she spoke again, and something in her voice made the whole room go still to listen. "The compact will pursue full restitution," she said. every mark, with interest, and I will personally ensure Desmond Calloway never again holds a signature authority in any house doing business on these coasts." A pause, precisely waited, but I want it noted, for the court's record, that the woman he tried to destroy in the press 3 days ago is the reason this fraud is being exposed at all, and not the reason it was ever hidden. I felt the room's attention shift again, and this time it landed on me the way sunlight lands on something it's finally decided to warm instead of burn. Desmond didn't look back as they let him out. I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't need him to. The hall did not empty quickly after Desmond was let out. The court had appetite left in it, and Roswin, I was learning, understood appetite well enough to feed it exactly what it needed, and nothing more. She had the registrar strike the fraud findings into the permanent record, had my uncle's signature authority revoked before the session closed, and stood at the center of that room the way she had stood at the top of the dais 3 weeks earlier, entirely certain, except now there was nothing careful left in the way she looked at me. "Wren Calloway," she said, and the sound of my name in her mouth, full and unhurried, in front of every person who had ever smirked at me across a dinner table, did something to my chest that the dress never had. I would like the court to also note that the debt bond I accepted 3 weeks ago was accepted honestly, and that I intend to finish what it started, honestly, in front of all of you, if she'll have me. "You're proposing," I said, in a room that still smells like my uncle's arrest. "I've never had good timing," Roswin said, and something in the flatness of it cracked into warmth I'd only seen in the kitchen, over coffee in the small hours. "I have very good aim, though. I'd rather say this to you now, honestly, in front of the people who doubted you, than wait for a quieter room that might never come." Ilse Voss, standing at Roswin's shoulder the way she had for 11 years, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "In 11 years," she said, "to no one and everyone, I have never once seen her sit still for anybody. She sat still for you within an hour of watching you walk through that door in a dress that should have gotten you thrown out of this hall." She looked at me, something gruff and approving in her weathered face. "Whatever you did to her, Miss Calloway, I'd suggest you keep doing it." The claiming happened 3 nights later, not in the hall, not in front of anyone, in the quiet room, with the east-facing window, where I'd first understood what it meant to be given space, instead of asked to shrink into someone else's. Roswin's hands were careful even then, tracing the line of my collar where the bond mark would go, and she asked me twice, with real words, whether I was certain, and I told her twice that I had never been more certain of anything since the morning I put on a dress no one had approved of and decided, for once, to choose my own ending. "Tell me to stop," she said, "and I will, even now." "Don't stop," I said, and meant it with my whole chest, and when her teeth found the joint of my neck and shoulder, the mark settled into my skin like a sentence finally punctuated correctly. Warm honey and pressed cotton meeting black pepper and cold brass until the room itself seemed to smell like something new that belonged to both of us and neither of us alone. Somewhere in the marrow of that moment I felt her, faint and unmistakable, the bond opening a thin bright channel between us, relief, want, and underneath it all, a fear finally allowed to unclench, 3 years of careful control loosening its grip 1 breath at a time. Afterward, in the gray hour before dawn, she traced the mark with 2 fingers like she still couldn't quite believe it was real. "I built a whole life out of never being surprised again," she said. "You've undone that so thoroughly, I'm not sure I mind losing the argument." "Good," I said. "I intend to keep surprising you. It seems to suit you." The wedding happened on a bright, ordinary Tuesday 6 weeks later, small by the standards of a compact that size, because Roswin had asked me what I wanted, and I had told her, honestly, that I wanted a room full of people who had actually earned the right to watch. Goldie stood beside me in a dress of her own making, the first thing she'd ever sewn that wasn't for someone else's inspection. Priya cried into the coffee she'd finally taught Roswin to make properly. Ilse Voss gave a toast so gruff and so sincere that half the room laughed, and the other half needed a moment before they could drink to it. The vows were short, the way both of us preferred things that mattered. "I will always choose the door I walked through myself," I told her, echoing, on purpose, the promise I'd made to Goldie the night we cut the red silk, and I choose this one, every day. Not because a debt made me, but because you kept asking instead of assuming. "You were never a price tag," Roswin said back, low enough that it felt like it belonged only to me even in a room full of witnesses. "You were the one who set the price on everything else in my life that mattered. Wear whatever you want to war from now on. I'll be standing wherever you're standing." By the second month, Desmond's remaining assets had been seized in full restitution, and his name struck from every registry that mattered in this city. The last I heard of him, he was managing a warehouse 2 coasts over under a name that wasn't quite his own, and I found I could think of that fact without any heat in my chest at all. Which felt, in its own quiet way, like the truest kind of justice, not cruelty, just consequence, finally arriving on schedule. A year on, the small room with Anniky's coat still hung on its hook, but the door to it stood open now. Not locked, not avoided. A place Roswin visited sometimes with something closer to peace than grief, and I never once begrudged her that, because love, I had learned, was never a ledger with only room for one name in the credit column. Roswin gave me, on our first anniversary, a narrow room off the east wing, with good light and 3 sewing machines, and a note that said only in her sparse handwriting for the atelier you never got to finish wanting. Goldie runs it with me 2 afternoons a week, and between us we have dressed half the daughters of the merchant court in things a little braver than what their mothers approved of. The red dress hangs now in a frame in our bedroom, one small bead missing from the hem, worked loose the night I walked into that hall and never recovered. Roswin keeps it, still, in a locket she wears under her shirt. The one piece of that day she never gave back. On the morning I finish telling this, the light comes through the east window the color it always does at that hour, gold and unhurried, falling across the framed dress, and the woman asleep beside me with her hand curled loosely around mine. Black pepper and cold brass gone soft with sleep, warm honey and pressed cotton answering it even in the quiet. I used to think being seen and being safe were different gifts, that you could only ever be handed one. I know better now. Being seen, fully, by someone willing to spend everything they have to keep seeing you, that was never the danger I dressed myself in red silk to escape. It was the only rescue I never knew how to ask for, until I stopped waiting to be approved of and simply walked in. The end.